Well, we are back here with another Power Monkey podcast with the man himself, Dave Tilley. Dave, how you doing, buddy?
Hello, I'm doing well. Haven't left my house in 7 days. I'm just kidding.
Yes,
Yeah.
blackout curtains in your own little dungeon up there, away from the world. I guess we should just let everybody know that we are in, I don't know, a week right now of it getting pretty serious with coronavirus, kind of taking up most of the headlines with everybody right now. But we're trying to bring some of our listeners some information that might be helpful, something to distract from all of the craziness, and obviously some insight into a world that Tilley is kind of at the forefront of. So first off, how you dealing with seclusion there, or how
Good,
bad is
man.
it where you're at?
I definitely had I have like the blurry days a little bit starting. You know what I mean? Like I'm trying to be pretty structured. I think that's the best thing we can do is maintain some sort of like, this isn't like a vacation. So like wake up, shower, go for a run, work out, do some business work. I try to keep structure to it, but I'll definitely like yesterday I was like, is it Wednesday? Is it Thursday? Like I don't even know what day it is right now.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's it in a little bit. And I think the hardest thing for me, man, is like there's so much change, but I'm having a tough time falling asleep. That's just the hardest thing for me is like I'm seeming to be distracted or I do stuff throughout the day and then I lay down in bed at like my normal bedtime or whatever. I'm just like thinking about everything. So that's been tough for me, but adjusting as we all are, man. Every time I went for a real hard run this morning and I was like running hills and I was like, God, I don't want to do this. I was like, oh, but I can breathe. So that's good. Like I'm happy I have my lungs.
What do you ever take anything to go to sleep? Anything
No, I normally didn't. I used to be pretty good about being able to read and just like tone down and I'd fall asleep pretty quick, but nothing just yet. Maybe I should.
I don't know, man. Some crazy shit. What about you, Chad? Have you had any issues sleeping or anything like that?
Not outside of what I ordinarily have, but I think I saw a study a number of years ago now about when you're kind of stuck in the same place for long periods of time, like days and weeks. And especially if I think this was more so when it's dark, but you tend to start to go to bed later and later. And I can't remember the exact time frame that it was geared towards that your body goes to, but it was interesting. And we just talked to Jamie last week about this as well, about you're mentioning potential supplements that you can take and stuff like that. And she was talking about cortisol and everything else. So for the listeners out there, if you haven't listened to that, go back and do that, especially if you're having a hard time sleeping. And well, not only with just being stuck in one place, but just with the stress that's going along with it. I mean, we're all part of small businesses, and every small business out there is scared right now. I mean, we're at the point right now. What's the date today? You were
20th.
just saying till it. Yeah, there's
no
20th.
idea.
So
May 3rd.
Yeah, we're just getting into every day. The government assistance is spreading to more and more states and more areas throughout the country. So I know on my end, I'm just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen with that. And so there's stress as well that we have to think about.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, you're right about small business stuff, and I don't really think the true effects economically are going to be seen for quite some time. But right now, it's just about trying to take it day by day, and the good things: be with your family as much as you can, and connect with people that you probably haven't talked to in a long time, and try to get those stupid home projects done that you always push off to the side. And just here being with Sadie and my daughter, and Sadie's 5 weeks away from having our second daughter. So we're, getting all prepped and aware of kind of what's going on with that too, not knowing whether or not we're going to be able to do it at the hospital. We might have to do home birth. So, so many things going on at the same time. So everybody's struggles are real right now. That's for sure.
Yeah. And that's the thing is there are blessings in all this too. I mean, and you really have to think about those, if you are at home with family, the extra time you get to spend with family, the extra time that you get to work on some of those projects that are a little bit more random for you can become a little bit more consistent. I'm getting to write a little bit more right now, which I love doing, and projects that I want to finish. So I think it's important to remember those things too.
Agreed.
Yeah, I agree, man. I've been able to shift a lot of stuff online, and the gymnastics community is really in a tough spot right now with everything going on. So I've been just quadrupling my efforts to try to help them, which is fun, but it's small doses, but you gotta, like you said, one day at a time.
Yeah. So Dave, a lot of our listeners might not know exactly what you're doing. within the gymnastics community, how you've been kind of, in my mind, you're leading a charge. You really kind of are at the forefront of really athlete wellness, and your background being what it is kind of lends itself probably more onto just the medical side, but you're doing much more than just kind of testing people for injuries and being preventative, and you're doing much more. And I think it's better for you to kind of touch on exactly all of the little nuances of the projects that you're working on. But essentially, you're trying to bring gymnastics to the next century into a new way of approaching the sport, a new way of trying to make sure that athletes have a safe environment, physically, emotionally, mentally, to be able to achieve their goals and to be able to do it in a manner that allows them to kind of grow as athletes and not just continue to do the same things that our previous generations have been doing. So I know that's a lot, and I know you're working on a ton, but can you kind of go into some of the things that you've been kind of spending your time on right now within the gymnastics community?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I really appreciate those kind words. And honestly, as I've told you many times and other people, I think Power Monkey has been a huge engine behind my work and my company and what I've been able to do. One, from an idea point of view of creative, influx, but also just in terms of you guys helping get behind some of the stuff I do. So I think a lot of this goes back to you guys, and thank you. But yeah, I mean, for anybody that's familiar with gymnastics, it's hard to believe that there's something worse right now happening with the coronavirus. But before this, we were in a bad spot politically and from a media point of view because of everything that happened. And I don't want to rehash the past, but what happened with the abuse scandal opened Pandora's box to maybe the cultural side of gymnastics, and some things that we all kind of felt it a little bit were not so great in terms of not everybody the way a few people were acting. And so it was just a combination of luck meets opportunity, where I was working pretty hard on some of these things already. And it allowed us to have a discussion about, what needs to change. And in my mind, I see my work with Shift and online and what I'm doing is kind of like three main pillars of what needs to happen. So one is a much more mandatory and structured education system. So I think we need a mandatory, you have to go through levels of courses to become a certified coach in gymnastics. And I think you have to do that to protect your athletes, but also to make sure you're doing what's scientifically supported or what multiple successful coaches have said is probably this best technique or something like that. So I'm trying to weigh in a little bit on taking, what I think my gift of curiosity is to put that into a digestible package for coaches. So that's one big part of it, is the educational system. Two, I think something that you've helped me a lot with develop is just we need a much better workload system for monitoring. We don't really know how to track gymnastics training loads accurately. So we have kind of one half of that, which they call an internal workload, which is how an athlete responds to a certain training stimulus. And then you have the external workload, which is, objective markers of, easy to see when you lift, oh, that's 100 kilos right there. That's 105, whatever it is. And you can track that. But in gymnastics, we're like, I don't know, we got a bunch of surfaces, a bunch of skills, a bunch of events. It's like, let's hope this goes well, which is, you need some coaching, finesse there for sure. But so that's kind of where most of my work has gone. I have a very big interest in the fields of stress, endocrinology, and a buzz term called epigenetics, which is essentially just how the environment changes the way that we develop. And so stress is very much the umbrella category, and monitoring is how we have a pulse on that. And so on the internal workload side, we're measuring some stuff, and there's two studies that unfortunately just ended very quickly on data correction with the NCAA about tracking teams for every day, rate your 0 to 10 exertion on each event, multiply that times time, multiply it times a weighting factor, and getting workload ratios there, which is really cool. That's going to be something that's really exciting. But on the external side, I just started doing some data collection on accelerometers that go through the shin with like straps, and you wear those while you tumble. And I sent you the video, Dave, but that's really cool as a prospect. So like the external piece of force on impacts is a good starting point, internal on that side. And that goes into wellness and asking your athletes how they feel and stuff. So that's the second facet. And the third facet, which I think everybody already knows is happening, is just culture, guidelines. I think we need really clear set behavioral and ethical standards about how you act in front of athletes and kids and what you do and don't do. And it doesn't matter whether you're coaching preschool gymnastics or you're an international elite and you've been to the Olympics. We should all adhere to the same guidelines of what it is to be a good human before you're a good gymnastics coach. So that's kind of the three-pronged approach that I kind of have right now.
I love that. Obviously all of those are critical. And all those really need to be kind of utilized together if you want to create a system that is preparing the athletes, the coaches, the parents, everyone within the community to kind of take the sport to the next level, right? And I'd like to just go a little bit deeper into that second portion, to the workload portion a little bit, because I find it to be fascinating. All the stuff that you showed me up to this point, on both pillars that you mentioned within that second component, are both really, really interesting. And I think, you're applying it to a generation of athletes that are a little bit younger, and, maybe our listeners are a little bit more into the CrossFit setting, or, not really interested specifically into, junior level gymnastics or collegiate level women's gymnastics. But there's a lot of transfer over in terms of its application to the population that we're working with. Can you just talk a little bit more about, one, the system that the workload system that you're putting together in terms of both sides of it? Just I'd like to get the listeners to hear a little bit more about how they work, how you're tracking things, those force plate things that you're talking about, and just kind of go a little bit deeper into some of those.
Yeah, for sure. So it actually is way more parallel to CrossFit than people think. And I think Olympic weightlifting as well, because originally the one step back is that this all came out of a very big body of research that Tim Gabbett is leading in workloads. And there's people who are criticizing the ratios that he used and stuff, rightfully so, because it doesn't tell you the whole picture, and he'd be the first person to tell you that. But it came from a need to have a way to objectively monitor a sport that's a little bit more abstract, like gymnastics. But a lot of these sports fall into the category. So CrossFit, wrestling, for example, like water polo and gymnastics, it's really hard to get good numbers behind that kind of stuff. Soccer, you slap a GPS monitor on someone, you can just see how long they run. It's a little bit easier in weightlifting because you just go total pounds or kilos lifted and stuff like that. And you can really get good ratios. But gymnastics, it's like very wishy-washy in terms of like the intensities and the surfaces and the training domains, and like same thing swimming. It's really hard to measure that, and Tim tried. But so essentially 4 years ago is when it started getting really popular. In 2015 or 16, Tim had a really popular paper that was essentially saying, should athletes be training smarter and harder, like that should push the envelope to be safe for training. And that kind of introduced the workload ratio. But I went to his courses and started talking with him about how in the world can I apply this to gymnastics? Because I knew from a medical point of view, it was really helpful in terms of injury risk. But I just couldn't really find a way to make it stick. So I took one of his courses. I took an online course. I had a lot of long talks with him and just read every book chapter and every research paper he put out. And when I went to New York and I took his course, he was suggesting that we should use a weighting factor as a way to kind of gauge zones of intensity here. So what they do in running is they do zones of high speed running. So they'll have like, okay, every like 0.2 miles per hour increase, you can see how fast someone's going from 0 to top speed high in running, because high speed running is correlated with hamstring strain risk, which is a big problem in kind of the sports he works in of rugby. But also they showed that spiking training volume in high speed running is maybe risk of injury goes up, but also the more time you spend in high speed running over a longer period of time, you can actually develop some protective fitness against an injury. So that's where it came from. And that's kind of what I started to mold with him. And it's essentially what it is people who aren't familiar in artistic gymnastics, they have different things that we do event-wise. So we usually have a warm-up, and on men's, there's 6 events, and women's, there's 4. Then you have some strength and conditioning. And so usually what people would do is they would do a session RPE, where they would do, how long were you training? 120 minutes, multiply that by a 0 to 10 rate of perceived exertion. And when you multiply those numbers, it gives you an idea of how a ballpark of the training load internally for the athlete. So you can start adding up, strength and conditioning in the morning, and then a training session on the equipment at night, like a college athlete would do. You get a number for the day, then you get a number for the week, and you can start to make ratios of 1 week compared to the previous 2 weeks, right? So a 1 week would be an acute load. The previous 2 weeks would be a chronic load. And so that's kind of where this idea came from, is that in gymnastics, what I started doing is realizing that somebody can be really, really good at floor and then completely tank on pommel horse, this guy, right? So like I'm going to rate floor as a much lesser demand for me, possibly because it comes naturally to me. Whereas pommel horse, it might take me an hour and a half to get through my routines, and I'm going to really be a lot more stress on that. So you can then start multiplying those numbers more. So the study that was active right now is that we had 2 collegiate teams say, okay, every day before practice, give me a 0 to 10 sleep quality, soreness level, fatigue level, and then a mood. And that kind of is a good wellness index for how they feel overall, state of readiness to train. And we multiply that by 100% out of 40 and get a number, 60, 70, 80% readiness to train. And then on the end of the practice, they go back through and say, okay, how long was I on my warm-up? 15 minutes. How hard do I think it was? 2. And then we multiply a weighting factor 1 through 4. So 1 is like easy, 2 is like skill combinations or more moderate intensity. 3 would be more like routines or a full routine or something of that nature. And then 4 would be a mock competition, something very stressfully, mentally and emotionally and physically. So we can then start to get more specific workload monitoring for like, okay, what's just floor or what's just vault or what's just rings, and add those up. And then we get numbers the same way you would anywhere else. We add the day, we look at ratios, and that's been really cool because it helps to individualize the training to the athlete a little bit more in terms of planning, but then also in terms of response. Everybody knows a time in their athletic career when their coach prescribed something that they thought was easy and you got buried by it, right? Whereas your friend who maybe didn't get buried by it. And that could be so many factors. I could have slept less. I could have had a fight with my wife. I could have had somebody, complaining about something, and I spent most of my time in a business meeting before I came to practice, and that was a problem or something like that. So it helps you get barometers on people individually. And that's really exciting because I think that it's a tool to have a better conversation with your athlete. It does not replace the training decisions that you make. And I think Tim's really adamant about that. So I think that
say that one more time. Just want to make sure the listeners hear that part of it.
Yeah, it's a tool that you can use to have a better conversation with your athlete. It does not replace your coaching decisions. It's not like you look at the numbers and you treat people as data sheets and you don't actually have a conversation with them. And that was the first thing Tim said at his course. And I was surprised by that because I had just been reading numbers and numbers from Tim for the last 6 years. So that's really important that it's a tool you use to better inform your training. And I think the other thing along those lines is that we shouldn't be trying to be stuck in a box with some of the monitoring tools. I think it's really important to integrate it as one piece. And I think the reason it matters for people listening in CrossFit is I've had some long conversations with Jay Leiden about this kind of stuff. And I think we could do a very similar thing for CrossFit. And Dan and I have talked about this, Dan Pope, whereas you could probably have your training sessions. So say you do a Hinshaw workout in the morning and you can rate that. And then you go do some active recovery stuff and you can rate that. Then you do a weightlifting session, you can rate that. Then you can go down and do some Metcons at the end of the day. People are training pretty hard. You can start to play around with some numbers there. And the biggest reason we're doing this is because we're trying to get an opportunity to look at what your stress system is doing and have some ideas about what's happening from a recruitment point of view. And we can go into some of the physiology of stress down the road, but it gives us an objective way to look at how the system is running instead of just being like, no, I feel okay. Like I don't feel okay. And there's sometimes when you maybe want to push really hard, but you realize you're redlining a couple of days in a row. And so you got to pull back. Or there's times when you might be under training. You got to get the fire going a little bit and you can push it pretty hard. So that's the internal side. The external side, do you want to talk about that first?
Yeah, I just a couple of questions in there. One, it's fascinating, right? To be able to kind of create a standardized way to track really optimizing training. How do we optimize training from all of these different facets? What goes into it from a mental, an emotional, physical standpoint, and can we put a number to that? And what you're doing with it and being able to actually find a route to be able to say, okay, this is where you are today, physical number, this is where you should be. I think it's going to go such a long way in being able to give the coaches and the athletes something to shoot for and something that's a little bit more concrete in terms of what they're trying to get out of their training. The question that I have for you is, how realistic is this? Yeah. This seems super complex. Yeah. The everyday coach, who are you working with? What's the average age of the person that you're testing with this?
So in the athletes that I piloted with myself, it was ages 14 to 18. And then obviously the NCAA teams are ages 17 to 21.
Right. So you have teenage population for a majority of it, 14 to 17, 14, 18, and then the collegiate level. For a majority of people, 14, especially high school students, I remember when I was in high school, like my priorities were not to every day I go into the gym, worry about what my mood was, what I ate, how much I slept. Yeah. What's the reality in terms of being able to get accurate information from people that, are of that age, who have so many other things going on? Do you find the data to be reliable enough to be able to say, okay, these are trends that we're seeing that are accurate? Or, how do you filter through that with the populations that you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that I unfortunately had to face the reality of, right? So you have like this mad scientist point of view when you set up a program, and you guys know, and anybody who's a coach does this, they sit in their whiteboard for like 3 hours, like, oh, I'm going to do this and that. We're going to cross-reference that. It's going to be like, I'm going to invent NASA all over again, right? And then you implement it and you get like 3 boxes filled out. And you're like, what the hell? This is
perfect.
Awful. So yeah, I started out overdoing these things. And what I came to realize, and Tim helped me with this, is that there's a couple things that are important. So one is that you can be the mad scientist on your end and look at all the data and the numbers, and you can do that yourself. But when it comes towards the athlete, it has to be the least friction possible for data collection. On the coaching side, it has to be the least friction possible for essential things you need to know. And so this is where I work with my software engineer to kind of build this, is that we have narrowed it down to answering 4 questions before practice in a very quick number database on your phone or something like that. I used to do it in binders, but now with the studies, they can do it via an app. So it's a 4-question survey. It takes 7 seconds when you walk into the gym. And then after, very quickly, it's 4 to 5 numbers after, about like, because if you do it right, you can fill in the time, and you can fill in the coaches are the ones who do the weighting factor. That's important to note. The coaches prescribe training, so they put it in. So all the athlete has to do is fill out 6 numbers after practice: warm up, vault, bars, beam, floor, and physical prepper for a guide be 8 numbers. So that's what we had to learn the hard way, is that when we really, really dumbed it down, we still had athletes in some of these studies that we're looking at now. Like we had maybe like a 70% compliance for some of them, but like I'd say like 10 of them out of all the ones we studied had solid data across like a lot of multiple weeks. And it's really cool to see some of their numbers. So yeah, we had to make it really easy. I mean, these are college kids, these are high school kids. They don't really care sometimes, nor do they want to be overwhelmed with all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, I mean, at that age too, you seem invincible, right?
Exactly.
Nothing really bothers you physically. You're just kind of going through, and every day you wake up, I feel great and ready to go the next day. So it just seems like, those are factors that you kind of have to play in. If you're working with a population of maybe CrossFitters or, CrossFit Games athletes, would you envision that the approach would be different, or would it be the same in terms of that type of population who's maybe a little bit older, later in their career, professional athlete that's maybe mid-20s to late 20s?
Yeah, good question. This is my experience, that with the kids and the younger ones, we're just trying to, like you said, we're trying to protect them from themselves a little bit sometimes when they're younger. So it's very simple on the high school training age side. But I personally noticed that when I got to the collecting data in the college level, especially the Division I athletes that we had, and then if we did test a little bit with some higher level CrossFit Games athletes and stuff like that. When you got into that population, they start to really want to know. They want to understand. They want to know what's going on under the hood of their own body. So in that circumstance, the other piece that I was going to say is that we have a coaching report that gets pumped out from the data. It's a 1-page report that says what you need to know and how it influences training. You see the trends of their wellness, you see the trends of their acute to chronic work ratios, and it's really, really helpful. That was where I just put my coaching hat on. I'm like, okay, what do I need to know when I'm walking into practice? And we would generate reports for the coach to look at just all of the athletes week to week. So in that context, when we started showing the athletes that data sheet that has some summary stuff, they were like, wow, this is really cool. And the compliance went up, but they also took a much more serious approach to, oh crap, I got to go to bed a little earlier. Like, yeah, I saw this big wellness plop. Like I didn't go to bed at time, or I ate like crap that day or something like that. And they feel it, and they know that it links to their conversation they can have with their coach. So as you get into the higher caliber athlete or the older athlete, they typically want to be more involved and they want to know. But in the lower ones, sometimes I show them very basic numbers, and sometimes we don't have a conversation about it until something's kind of falling apart a little bit.
Right. How's the coaches' involvement been? Have you seen coaches jumping on board with something like this, or has there been hesitation?
Yeah, no, they love it. I think, again, initially it was too much, and I had to kind of go back to the drawing board a couple of times. But I think now that the thing is that I think people are more on board, because I've talked with some other professionals around the world at high level sport who just said like the sports scientist section came to them and just threw something at them. They didn't really understand the sport well enough, and they didn't feel like they knew what was going on. And so they felt like those felt on deaf ears, because it was like just testing to test. It wasn't helpful. But I think this being, as I have a coaching eye, and I also know from the athlete point of view, what kind of goes on, they're a little more, willing to sink their teeth into it a little bit. But if we make it simple for them in terms of execution and give them a pretty good summary of the data, they seem to really like it. Definitely the coaches at the NCAA level, when the first couple of weeks were bumpy, but when I started getting reports to them weekly, they're like, damn, this is really cool. And I think what I showed them is probably 1/5 of the potential of the system to look at. Really, you can start to split out between, specialists can just look at floor and vault volume versus the entire practice. And then now myself and Ellen Casey are starting a study to look at Achilles tear risk factors in college gymnastics. So using a lot of this kind of stuff, we can look at training load, workload of floor versus vault, and a lot of other risk factors. That's the beauty of the system, is that Tim's work has shown the injury risk, not the injury rate. You can push hard. If you train smart and train hard for a long chronic load, you can maybe reduce your risk of injury, but also it correlates to performance. So we can help people peak a little bit better. We can help people understand training hard and training smart is good. We want to be fit. We want to push ourselves, but we have to do it intelligently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dave, this is incredible. I mean, you're collecting data by asking certain questions to these athletes, but with the number system that you talk about, it sounds very similar to the way many years ago now, I started writing programs for myself. And still use the same method. I'm just a little bit better at it. So I don't have to go into the numbers quite as much as I used to for the programs that I write now. But I think I think this could be a good, little bit of a different spin on it to go over, because we are talking mostly to CrossFitters, and I hope that a lot of weightlifters are out there listening as well. But, you know, for weightlifting specifically, the way that I used to lay out my programs, because I wanted to make sure that my workload was spread out appropriately through the weeks, and that I was following, week 1 needs to be heavy, week 2 needs to be heavy overall, and then week 3 needs to be back off. So it's a way that I was able to lay those out. And then obviously for myself, since I programmed for myself from that general program that I wrote out, I was able to make those adjustments on the fly. But the better I got at this programming system, the less adjusting I had to do. So it's a potential way that someone could go look at their weightlifting program or their CrossFit program as a whole and just see where really the light days are. For example, if you know this is supposed to be a light day, but it looks similar number wise to what's supposed to be a heavy day, then you need to reposition things a little bit. But for example, what I would do is I would give every exercise and the total volume that I was doing with that exercise. So load multiplied by the number of repetitions that I'm doing, a number from 1 to 5, and 5 was the hardest. So for example, if I was doing 6 sets of 5 at 80% in the back squat, that's supposed to be at that percentage. It's supposed to kick your ass, right? So that's a 5. Okay. If I was doing, say, a strict muscle snatch just from the standing position, where I'm not putting any power into the bar, it's going to limit the amount of weight that I'm going to be able to use in that specific exercise. So I'm going to give that exercise like a 1, right? So I had a certain total number for the day that I wanted to hit if that was supposed to be a heavy workout. And then I had a certain number for the day total, that a range that I wanted to hit if it was supposed to be medium and if it was supposed to be light. A couple other rules that I would follow is that I wasn't allowed to have any more than 1 5 in the same workout unless it was close to competition and I was doing a max snatch and a max clean and jerk. In that aspect, a max snatch and clean and jerk, even though typically you're not doing a whole lot of reps, you're just working up to a max, I would still consider those days 5s for those specific exercises, because there's a lot more going into it just than just the workload. So kind of following those rules and seeing truly number wise how well the week is laid out and how well the weeks are laid out really is how I developed the ability to program, in my opinion, better for other athletes. But again, I think it's a good way that, you know, in combination with using this type of system that you're talking about, not only for gymnastics, but other sports, for CrossFit and for weightlifting as well, just in regards to how are you feeling this day, and hey, this exercise is supposed to be a 5, for example, in the terms that I'm talking about, but it felt more like a 3. Well, we might need to change the numbers that we're giving to the exercises and the loads that you're using. So I just thought it just reminded me so much of the way that I used to program for myself, and like I said, still do now. And I think, you know, a good way and a good method for athletes out there that are listening to kind of give their program a look.
Yeah, absolutely. Super well said. And I can kind of summarize 2 continuation points I think would be really helpful for people to kind of understand these concepts. And so the one thing you have to remember is that our stress system and the way we adapt is built for an acute load followed by a recovery period. And the same system that is built from a hormonal point of view and also from a systematic point of view is good in the short term, but can kill us in the long term. So it's like not good to keep flooding your body with cortisol and with chronic stress hormones and stuff like that. It's not designed for that. So the way we look at that in the context of training workloads is there's 2 things. One is that you're alluding to is that if you're supposed to be training hard and you're not really getting the stimulus that you're looking for, then we have to modify something to make sure we can get there, right? And on the opposite side of that, if you're supposed to have a deload day or a deload week and you're rating these things as very, very strenuous and very, very hard, well, you may have tipped the razor's edge a little bit and gone into what they call non-functional overreaching, where more is not better. So it allows you to stay in the bumper lanes between pushing that acute stimulus, giving yourself a reaction, and not getting to the point where you're overtrained and your body is telling you that you're feeling the excessive flood of cortisol or something that's going wrong. And I think a new paper just came out with Tim, and the way you apply this to a training workload season is that Tim has these concepts called the floor, the ceiling, and then time, right? So the ceiling is the highest workload you need to get to achieve your competitive goal or to achieve whatever it is. For example, it might be a max out at a certain meet at nationals. It might be for gymnasts, a national championship or something like that, if it's the games for the athletes or whatever it is. So you're working towards that chronic high peak ceiling of the most brutal beating you need to be able to take and successfully compete. And then you look at, okay, and when I'm starting my preseason, what's my floor? Where am I at right now for my training load? If I have taken an off season or I haven't really trained too hard, I have a floor down here and I need to get to the ceiling, right? If you really push those things together and you spike your training load and you don't work out long enough, early enough, and you jump from the floor to the ceiling, the risk of injury is very, very high. So one way you can manipulate your programming is try to extend the proper dosage of time to get from the floor to the ceiling, but it requires, which is where some of the studies I'm doing now are normative data studies to try to look at what's hard for what's an NCAA season look like, what's it called, like for you, it'd be like, what's a season of CrossFit look like? What's a season of weightlifting look like? You can look at the chronic load you need to get to be safe. You can then say, okay, so I'm at 1,000. I need to get to 10,000. How can I do this safely over rising peaks up and down where I crawl my way up to that? And that's how you have monitoring let you get there, but you can kind of play with those. If you get an injury, Tim calls you're in the basement now. If you get an injury or you really had a crappy preseason where you did nothing for 2 months and just sat on your butt, well, now you're in the basement, right? You need to get to a higher preseason level of fitness. So maybe you can achieve an even higher level of ceiling, to try to get yourself higher. But if you know the demands of what you're trying to get to with monitoring, you can plan a program over 6 months or 8 months to really get there safely and not just, throw crap against the wall and hope it sticks and hope you're fit enough.
Yep.
Yeah. So a lot of that has to do with kind of gradual training and
Yep.
periodizing your training correctly, as opposed to just saying, that, oh shit moment, the competition's coming. Am I prepared? Am I not? Let me just, dump a bunch of stuff in here and hope for the best at the end. So,
well, that's the way that I train now, Dave, as a master weightlifter. It's just, I decide that I want to do a competition out of nowhere, and then I do a couple snatches a few days before, and I'm good to go.
You're probably an outlier here because you do that, and then you set world records.
We call you a statistical anomaly.
Yeah, we don't really want to use you as an example, Mr.
No, that's not good. But
that's in your immortals, Chad.
Yeah. Well, but there is something to be said for the amount of training that I and we all put in for many, many, many years that, brings our strength level and skill level up to a place where you can get away with a little bit more of that. But yeah, certainly, those, like you said, Tilley, those things were built into over many years and over and over and over again through different cycles. And in weightlifting, that means that very typically, you're going to see pretty much the same thing in almost any weightlifting program. We're starting off with lots of reps and lots of volume and the strength movements and squats and presses and deadlifts and, lighter Olympic lifts, lighter snatches and clean and jerks and variations of those and working on technique. And then we're going to come to a crossing where those reps are less in the squats and the reps start to increase up in the Olympic lifts as the load starts to increase in the Olympic lifts. And though we're still lifting heavy in the strength movements, we're not doing a whole lot of volume there towards the end. Most of our volume is with low repetition snatching and clean and jerks, but accumulating more repetition there as well. So if your program, if your weightlifting program specifically, and your CrossFit program too, doesn't look a little bit like that, where you can noticeably see difference in phases, can you noticeably pick out phases in your programming? And if you can't, then you probably need to do something different.
Yeah, completely. And I agree. And it's cool for me. I mean, on one side, it serves the geeky curiosity that I have to understand this whole thing and understand what's going on with myself as an athlete and a coach. But at the same time, I think it really allows us to have a good conversation about, the emotional well-being and the physical well-being of the athlete. And I think that's really important. I think that all of us, everybody wants to compete, they want to win, and that's definitely a way to use this tool. But for me, I always have a large amount of empathy for the athletes themselves. And especially as you work your way up into the higher level ones, I feel like sometimes the athletes that I've worked with at the games level or the elite level on the gymnastics side, they sometimes feel as though they're just the athlete, and people forget they're humans and they forget that they have emotions and that they're going through very high stress situations. And it's a lot, especially on a young elite kid. So I think that it helps me to just have a better pulse of empathy on them, because you can see what's going on and have a conversation. And that's personally why I spend so much time on it, because I think that's probably a little bit more important. And then it does help you from a performance point of view as well.
Well,
Yeah, well,
Dave,
somebody's got to put. No, go ahead, Dave. I was just
no, go
gonna
ahead,
say,
Jay.
somebody's got to put that type of work in, and there's nobody better to do it than you, Tilly. That's for sure.
Thanks, man.
So, Dave, you were a gymnast yourself, competing at the collegiate level. When you were a gymnast, how much weightlifting did you do as part of your training?
So I didn't do any weightlifting until I went to Springfield College for my first training year. And it was kind of thrown at us a little bit. It was like, God, I love my coach, but he was on the older side, wiser, we should say. But he was like, yeah, go lift with the strength coaches. And they kind of gave us a football program.
Even that's rare for a gymnastics coach to even recommend going to strength conditioning.
Yeah, I think it was just like part of their program that every other team was doing. And so they kind of had to, I don't know. But we had some good GAs who helped us out. And so I didn't do any weightlifting as I was going up. But then I started in college. We lifted 2 days per week in the preseason for like maybe 8 weeks. And then we stopped during the year. And then I kind of worked out on my own a little bit in the summers, but I didn't really use that much at all. And to be honest, when I was a younger coach in my 21, 22, and I had a massive ego, I was like, nah, no gymnastics, no weightlifting at all, like only calisthenics, all that kind of stuff. And I got humbled very fast when I realized how much of an idiot I was and I didn't know enough. And so I started studying more. And this came from the CrossFit gym that I started to be a part of up here in Boston. Matt Fraser's old Olympic coach was actually the coach there for Olympic lifting, which is wild, Andy Tisch. So I learned a lot from him. And then I started getting involved with Power Monkey more. And I listened to Jay and Chris and everybody else and Chad. And I was just like, all right, I know nothing. And I started to kind of investigate and sprinkle in. I was doing my sports boards there after my doctoral work. And so I kind of was getting a dose of that from the medical side. And everything was pointing towards this is a no-brainer. This has got to happen. This is like, every medical provider is doing it. Every other sport is doing it. And I think we just don't have the right formula. And then over the course of like 5 years, as I became a strength coach, I found there's a lot that gymnasts, I think, shouldn't do, but there's a lot that's very, very beneficial, and all the myths and misunderstandings can be pushed away.
Yeah, you mentioned myths there, Tilly. In gymnastics, there's certainly a lot of myths about weightlifting, lifting weights on a regular basis and what it can do to your body, bad things that it can do to your body, but also in other sports and in CrossFit as well. I think some of those myths are similar. Can you go over maybe just a couple of the ones that you feel are most common?
Yeah, for sure. So the three most common ones that I hear this from the gymnastics side. I hear this from the general consumer to CrossFit side. And I hear this from the medical community as well. One is that weightlifting will automatically make you bulk up, and just become like, what's that guy from the Fantastic Four? Like all the stones, make you look like that.
Thing?
Yeah, the Thing. Yeah, exactly. So people think that I can't lift a weight because I'll become like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? And that's just not true. There's so many, and I learned this from the Olympic lifting community, because I think I met Jess Lucero at one of the camps, and she was saying how much volume she has to put in, how much work she has to put into just to get like a little bit of extra lean body mass on her legs or something like that. Like, it's crazy how much you have to lift and eat to gain that much, to get stronger, to lift even just 1 or 2 kilos more. So that's not true. It comes down to the exercise programming. It comes down to nutrition. It comes down to the total work that you're doing, the type of exercises you can program for power biases over true mass and strength if you're looking for more like a body weight explosive sport like gymnastics. And so, I mean, if that were true, I think Rupert told me this, if this myth was true, every high school boy would be massive, right? Because all they would do is just want to lift and get huge. So that one you can throw out the window. The second one that people kind of talk about is that you'll lose your flexibility. And I think that this one comes out of acutely, yeah, you lift hard and you lift heavy, like the next day or so you have DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, and you're definitely sore, but most people recover within a couple of days. And I think the problem with this comes out, one, because people don't have a well-balanced strength program. They're doing a lot of repetitive movements. Gymnastics is guilty of this. I think CrossFit is guilty of this. So that's part of it. But also too, is just the research suggests that if you're doing proper, programming, and you're also using maybe more of an eccentric and a pause or a tempo bias, you can probably actually protect yourself in full range of motion. And I think that most people would know that weightlifters are very mobile, gymnasts are very mobile, and many other athletes are very mobile. So that one is typically able to be thrown out the window as long as you're thinking intelligently. And the last one is that you'll just automatically get hurt. And I always say that this one is a little bit hysterical and hypocritical, because if you think that lifting a 20-pound dumbbell or a 45-pound barbell or deadlifting 135 is dangerous for a young kid, but you're allowing them to do gymnastics, which has forces that are quadruple your times in body weight, that's a little bit, hypocritical. So it's like, you have to think about what you're doing. If we let kids do double backs on floors, or let kids do throw a baseball, at 70 miles an hour, then we have to also be kind of on the fence of making sure the injury risk is lower for both. It's all about programming and having a good coach and proper technique and proper progression, everything you would say for a weightlifter or a CrossFit athlete or for a gymnast. This is just no different.
Yeah, you talk about flexibility, and I love this statistic, and I hate it at the same time. Gymnasts are known as the most flexible athletes in the Olympics, and weightlifters, contrary to misconception and what makes sense to a lot of people, are second, right behind them. So I wonder, can you compare the typical mobility and flexibility strengths that a gymnast has versus weightlifters? Do you feel like gymnasts are likely to have specific or more mobility in certain areas where weightlifters might have a little bit better in some others?
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely gender specific. And it's been interesting because Dan Pope and I are fortunate to work with athletes year round and not just when they're injured. We work with a lot of like just sports performance. So we can see someone over the course of a season. But typically, a lot of the natural mobility that weightlifters have and gymnasts come from like the inherent gifts they're given from a genetic point of view. So you have someone who has a slightly shallower hip socket, right? It's called the dysplastic hip. They can just move their hip through a larger range of motion because they don't have the same over coverage of the hip as somebody else does. So that's one piece of it from a bony morphology point of view. But then as like your collagen tissue is typically just a little bit more lax. So joint capsules are a little bit more lax. It allows you to squat deeper and things of that nature, which comes with maybe an Achilles tendon and a calf that's more flexible. So you can have good ankle mobility. So typically gymnasts both have gymnasts and weightlifters have very mobile hips. The differences tend to come in soft tissue adaptations over time. I think that the shoulders of both athletes are pretty mobile. But what we're finding in CrossFit for sure, if we think about repetitive stress, is that the more you use the same motion over and over and over, you lose flexibility due to soft tissue stiffness and some of the overload there. So baseball players, for example, after they throw an inning in a bullpen, and our boss Mike did this with the Red Sox, we saw a loss in IR within like an hour, after right away. And the more you throw, you lose overhead flexibility as well. And so we're finding that in gymnastics with like if you watch how hard they tap, we find that. But Dan and I have also found that pulling off the ground quite a bit and keeping the bar close can definitely make your lats and your teres major get real stiff over time. And when you squat out of the bottom of a front squat or a hole, your adductors fire like crazy to get that first 25% up. So it's like we see a lot of adaptive stiffness in the adductors and the underarm of the weightlifter or the CrossFit athlete, especially when CrossFit athletes are doing touch and go reps. That motion mimics the internal rotation that slows down in a baseball player. And we have no empirical data on this, but we think the touch and go volume or the repetitive chest to bar volume essentially overloads the shoulder. So they have a capsular flexibility underneath, but you can't see it because the soft tissue stiffness is so stiff. And again, their programming is a little bit imbalanced. There's not a lot of direct pulling or glute training, and it doesn't really keep them mobile.
Well, for the baseball player, I wonder, my mind immediately goes to what if they were doing maybe even right after the game, some handstands just to be nice to you gymnast, or putting a bar overhead. Would that offset some of that tightness that's creeping in if they went in and said, maybe they go do a overhead pressing capacity WOD workout real quick where they're flushing their upper body to help recover, but also they're moving through that range of motion to try to offset some of that tightness that's coming in. And that being said, are there certain things that you guys do in the PT world to help these CrossFitters and weightlifters and gymnasts from that stuff creeping in as well?
Yeah, good question. And so it's interesting when you look at, again, some of the work that our bosses have done with baseball players. So in a baseball player, the reason that they have more external rotation or layback and they lose IR is because of a bony adaptation from when they're little. So when they throw light toss from a little kid and they start pitching in little league, their bone actually, the growth plate warps backwards and they have more retroversion. So their shoulder actually adapts from a bony point of view to give them a loss of IR and more layback. So for them, I think some of these things still apply, but it comes down to the apparatus they use. I think that for baseball players, it's sometimes really hard to get a close bar to do a snatch or a clean because they have one shoulder that looks like this. Right. And they can't get the bar close from a bone, but they could easily do some stuff with dumbbells that free up overhead stuff. And we have a lot of the guys at Champion come in off season are doing landmine pressing and barbell stuff and plenty of other types of, stuff like that. I think for the weightlifter and for the gymnast, it's a very different conversation because maybe it's true. We don't know, but we don't have any studies to show the bony losses like that. I think that young gymnasts and young weightlifters have hip morphology adaptations. I think that the more they squat and the more they do splits and they do jumps and leaps and pommels and stuff like that, I do think their hips probably rotate, but we don't have any good ultrasound data to look at that. But that being said, the two things that we really tell people at Champion for in-season management is like, whenever you do your sport over and over, two things happen. You get tight and you get tired, right? So you have to have some sort of strategy to manage the adaptive soft tissue stiffness that's happening from this high intensity repetitive exercise. So, whether that's manual therapy and you get a 15-minute manual therapy session to try to get some of that soft tissue to be loose again, or you do some soft tissue work, you do some eccentrics in your warm-up to try to get some of that stiffness to come back, or you're programming some like opposing muscle group to keep yourself balanced. I think that's really important. And so that's a lot of the work that we do, is consulting people and building programs that are recovery programs. So we'll have like a women's specific artistic gymnastics recovery program that I've built for some of those athletes, or a male specific. And I think that CrossFitters are seeing more people doing those kind of programs, but you need consulting on proper manual therapy. And the biggest thing is you need someone to screen you against your own baseline. It's really hard to do this on yourself, but in the beginning of a preseason, we screen people and we know what they are. But athletes that come to me and work year round, whether it's CrossFit or whether it's lifting or whether it's gymnastics, we do a full assessment and I know what their shoulders and their hips look like from a normative preseason baseline. So when I was working with athletes during the regionals and the games a couple of years ago, I knew exactly what they looked like before their competitive season started. So if I knew they had this amount of loss of shoulder flexibility, well, that's just you. That's just who you are. You're just a little stiffer. That's fine. That might make you a powerful athlete. Same thing with their legs. But if they usually have 170 degrees and they're at 150 after a really hard chest to bar workout, well, that's a problem. We need to fix that. And so we're trying to help them restore. And Mike taught me this really early on, and it stuck with me. He's like, I always tell people, I want you to be you, not more than you and not less than you. I want you to always walk on the field or grab the barbell or go into an arena as your version of what normal is for you. And so we try to do those baselines and teach them how can they take care of themselves, or what can they do on recovery days to try to get them back to their normative baseline before they go back out from a biomechanical point of view, not from like a fitness or a fatigue point of view.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's similar to a perspective that John Roethlisberger, three-time U.S. Olympian, one of the owners of Flip Fest, used to say all the time, because, he wasn't one of the most talented guys in the world. His goal was always to maximize his human potential. And that's the way that I always approached it too. The guys that you're up training next to might be more talented, more capable, but all you can do is maximize your own potential. And that's it. And doing the assessment and figuring out where your strengths and weaknesses and limitations and things like that will allow you to kind of direct your training appropriately. Mm-hmm. So you can do those, you can optimize your training. Dave, you touched on it slightly, but this is a big topic that we talk about when we're at Power Monkey Camp, when you're helping me out with the handstand station, things like that. But you mentioned a little bit about some of the repetitive actions that you see, maybe a CrossFit type of a WOD, creating specific fatigue and specific limitations within certain muscle groups that we're constantly seeing across the board. And it might be, creating limitations down the pipeline that are being seen in other areas, in other muscle groups and other movement patterns. The one that specifically comes to mind, because we've talked about a lot with handstands, has to do with kind of overhead position. The soft tissue of the underarm being limited because of a lot of the repetition that we're seeing with certain movements. Can you just touch on that a little bit more deeply? And then also a little bit more on the correctives that you'd normally recommend in terms of what you're seeing from the scientific side, what's most beneficial, what a lot of people are maybe doing right now that are maybe spinning their wheels, and what you'd kind of direct people towards in terms of where those limitations are being seen.
Yeah, for sure. Really good question. And we've had a good discussion. I've learned so much from the coaches at camp kind of generate these ideas, which is great. But essentially, when you look at the CrossFit spectrum of movements they do pretty regularly, there's four main categories of upper body pushing or pulling. We'll just go for the shoulder specifically. But so horizontal pushing, horizontal pulling, right? So burpees or push-ups or stuff like that. And then horizontal rowing, not a lot, which is a big part of this, which is like erg rowing, bent over barbell rows, that's all I got. It's like direct pulling is very limited versus overhead vertical pressing and overhead vertical pulling is extremely dominant. So we have three categories out of the four that are very, very overworked. Look at muscle up, pull up, or ski erg, chest to bar, pull-ups, all that kind of stuff is all in the same kind of categories than push-ups. And dips are kind of a weird one though, but they kind of go into a chest dominant activity. So they kind of get lumped with burpees. But think about building a tent. If you build a tent and you put three corners super strong and left one not attached, it's not going to go well, So I think that's what we find is a lot of repetitive actions of chest to bars and all that kind of stuff makes. So the lat is probably the biggest stiffness generator when someone who has a lot of high volume, but overlooked is the teres major, which is a smaller muscle, but it's the main kind of puller or adductor down, especially with rope climbs and stuff like that. And so chest, lat, teres major are pretty big stiffness drivers. And then you could argue too, one of your cuff muscles called your subscap is also an internal rotator, but those muscles are typically way more overdeveloped and way more worked than some of the muscles in the back. So your rhomboids, your middle traps, your lower traps, your cuff muscles, the external rotators, and the direct horizontal pullers. And so it's constantly for us, we're trying to use assessments to measure overhead flexibility, as I alluded to, but then also do strength testing and ratios to try to figure out what's your pushing to pulling ratio, right? If you only do erg rowing, then once in a while an accessory do bent over dumbbell or barbell rows, that is not going to even touch how many burpees and how many benches you're doing and muscle ups and stuff like that. And so you can use a dynamometer to strength test ER cuff and like posterior scap cuff compared to your chest. But also you can use an index of just like how many strict push-ups can you do compared to how many feet elevated rows can you do. So the opposite of a push-up, and we use this as a corrective a lot, is feet up on a bench, put a low barbell and a low rack, and just do straight horizontal rows to your chest. I am willing to bet that most people out there could probably do 100 push-ups if they needed to, and could probably do 40, maybe good quality horizontal face rows. So those are usually
100 push-ups, Dave. That's you're giving a lot of credit to a lot of people out there. 100 push-ups straight. That's not easy to do. If you can do that, that's impressive stuff. But percentage-wise, you're saying it's about 40%.
That's my estimate. Yeah, we don't have ratios, but I would say it's probably a 25 to 40% ratio, which is a problem because when you get into overhead stacked positions, you need the flexibility to get overhead, first of all, but then your ability to control a handstand or a jerk or catch a snatch is directly related to how much scap strength you have, right? You don't rest on your pecs when you're overhead, you rest on your scap, depression and elevation. So the strength capacity of your upper back to catch that weight or catch that handstand position smooth in a nice stacked position is one part, but then the strength and the endurance, which is a factor of strength, or the power, which is also a function of strength, the ability to do that well with your scaps requires just grunt work, just hypertrophy. And so when we have people who have these issues, and it's common, we usually first approach activity modification and workload modification. So if someone can't get their arms over their head, strict handstand push-ups are probably not a great idea right now. So we put them to a regression where it's angled, or we do a landmine press or a pike handstand push-up and maintain their capacity. But then we are working the soft tissue stuff or the thoracic spine or the neck flexibility, but we're going crazy on upper back rowing. So face pulls, bent over dumbbell rows or barbell rows, face pulls and horizontal rows like I just talked about. We're going really hard in that kind of stuff. And the manual strengthening we do for cuff in the clinic is, it's shocking to see, but I've had some pretty household names, games athletes who get completely smoked by some of our more introductory cuff work. And it just shows you that the ratios are a little off. So we're giving people side-lying dumbbell external rotation, pros T, prone Ys, prone Us at hard enough weight to build hypertrophy, 3 sets to 4 sets of 8 to 12, not, 4-pound dumbbells for 15 or 20 reps because it's like an endurance thing. We need cross-sectional area to grow and get hypertrophy because you're trying to do shit that's 3, 4, 5, 6 times your body weight in forces. And like same thing with throwing a baseball, like it'll rip your arm off your shoulder if you're not comfortable. Yeah. So you have to build strength. So it's a combination of the flexibility work and the recovery work, but then also just like 2 times a week, people leave our clinic with like a noodle arm, like in a good way. We're roasting their cuff and writing an accessory program or a home program that they can still train super hard in many domains, but we're trying to modify things around where their limitations are.
Well, I love the strength side and that strength building portion of the component there. And, when we're talking about in the gymnastics world, our phases in the Power Monkey world in terms of how we build gymnastics skills is that first phase is creation of body shapes. It's strength and core strength and mobility. Those two need to be together if we can actually create the shapes that we want to be utilizing at a higher level when we're working on skills. You talked about how you envision balancing out the strength side. What about the mobility component? Can you give a couple of factors and what you're seeing in terms of what's beneficial, how people are applying mobility right now, what are the areas that people are missing out on, and what you're seeing from a scientific side that is actually most critical when it comes to, tackling mobility?
Yep. Yeah. Very, very, very good. And I think this is a situation where you have to follow the evidence and you have to follow the bird's eye view of the literature. You can't just go on YouTube, Johnny Pants 44 who owns a gym and he says this is a really good exercise. Like you have to really follow empirical data. And I think that there's a lot of things that we know from the research world may be helpful for mobility. And we have to try to use the best of them that we know, right? So the approach that we usually use, and I think manual therapy and foam rolling and stuff always comes up as the first thing as people are jumping to. And don't get me wrong, it has a role to play, but it is definitely not the only thing you should be doing. If you foam roll for 40 minutes and work out for 10, that's a big problem, right? right? You need to really have a structured plan of get a screen and know what muscles are involved, which is what we just talked about. But once you know that, have a few things that you know are super helpful. So foam rolling or manual therapy does not break up scar tissue. It doesn't break down adhesions. It doesn't like do all that kind of stuff. The best research we have right now is that it temporarily reduces the threshold or the pain sensitivity of muscles to tolerate stretching.
So it just desensitizes essentially for you to be able to do the movement.
Yeah, there's two factors, right? There's a mechanical factor and there's a neurological factor. From a mechanical point of view, people think that it's maybe more blood flow to the area. There's more water hydration, which makes the muscle maybe a little bit more pliable. And that maybe you do get some relaxation from a neurological point of view, or these receptors called nociceptors, which transmit pain, maybe we calm them down over time, right? And so there were some big literature reviews that said that foam rolling does not have to hurt to work. You don't need to like put a spiky foam roller and light it on fire for it to like work properly, right? Just basic soft tissue care, 30 seconds each side for muscle groups is probably okay. And again, the research is mixed, but we still use it. People move better. They feel better. It's 1/5 of our program, right? Next to that, something that's well supported in research that everybody knows is just like classic stretching, right? And the biggest thing about stretching is that you have to understand you're doing it for a specific reason to get a specific muscle group to stretch, right? So some stretches might be more like capsular in nature. And you and I have talked about this before of just like cranking your arms overhead is probably not going to get the lats themselves because it internally rotates your shoulder. So you have to be externally rotated, and grabbing a stick with your elbows close on a box is a really good way to do this. But externally rotating gets the lats and the teres major more. So when you lean back, you feel a stretch here under your armpit, not in the top of your shoulder. One is subacromial impingement, which is not helpful. One is a true soft tissue stretch. So once you understand screening and you can get a proper diagnosis to stretch certain muscle groups, 2 or 3 stretches, right, probably are better to do every day consistently than like blowing yourself up in like a 90-minute stretching session. And the research reflects that, which is where I was going next, is a big systematic review, looked at all these different studies and said, what type of stretching is effective and why does it work? And so what they found is that 30 seconds or so of a well-done stretch every day, 5 to 6 days per week, 2 sets of 30 seconds was just as effective, if not more effective than many other types of stretching. And they all work, static stretching, PNF stretching, but the consistency was more important than intensity. And I think that's the takeaway here, is that doing something that you know is helpful from a diagnostic point of view every single day helps calm down that pain sensitivity of those nociceptors, we think. And it also just adapts the muscle to getting comfortable stretching, right? Stretching is uncomfortable as it should be, but the more you do it, the more desensitized those nerve endings get. And that's what we think as of right now, we think is the main reason that stretching kind of does its thing, is they have these people in these research studies, and I don't know who volunteers for these, probably grad students who need money, but they put them in this terrible hamstring stretching device and they stretch them every day for 6 weeks, and they measure the properties of the stretchiness of their muscle fibers. And we don't see muscles truly getting longer in series. We see muscles that are, a couple studies do, but we see most of the studies support that the muscle length is not changing. Sarcomere-genesis is not occurring, but there's still range of motion increases, which is like, well, what the hell is going on there? Well, it means that the sensitization is lower. So they don't actually have longer muscles. They're just, more comfortable stretching. So in summary, a little bit of foam rolling to the proper muscle group, proper stretching every day, and then following that up immediately with some eccentric training, which we've talked about. But concentric being when you close a joint angle, eccentric being lifting a weight when you open a joint angle. And the research does support in some rat models and some other models that if you do eccentrics over a long time, then you have some elongation of those muscle fibers, right? You can induce sarcomere-genesis. They like pinned the lat of a rabbit in a little machine, and over time they saw some sarcomere-genesis. That's a far cry from the lab to the actual person, but that's the thought, is that 5 second lower and a 5 second pause for 5 reps of a heavy RDL, or in a warm up doing if you have quad and hip flexor stiffness doing a split squat, if you have lat stiffness doing a close grip chin up and slowly lowering, that's going to hopefully get some of those muscle adaptations to occur. So then you go through and you do some strength and conditioning type stuff to balance the opposite, like we talked about. And then you just go do good technical drills, like empty barbell or whatever it is, to reinforce that motion, or like a handstand. And you work through a circuit like that, like a little bit of foam rolling, a little bit of stretching, 5 eccentrics, maybe a couple drills that you're doing for an overhead press or a handstand push-up that you're doing. And doing that for a couple of rounds in a warm-up, we found to be much more effective than 30 minutes of just foam rolling and stretching and then being like, all right, let's try to do Fran.
Right. So it really is a combination of trying to figure out the desensitization that comes along with passive stretching or PNF or foam rolling, the general methods that people are using for gaining mobility. In conjunction with sarcomere-genesis, you're talking about elongating of the muscle fibers, which is shown to be done primarily through negatives, through eccentric action of that specific muscle group. That to me is fascinating. And, it's really the only thing right now that's being shown to actually elongate the muscle fibers is those eccentric actions done in conjunction with one another. And I think that's really one of the big take home points here is if you want to become more mobile, if you want to become capable of getting into a better overhead position, into a better split or whatever it might be, it's a combination of these things. It's not one or the other that's going to be optimal, right? You're suggesting kind of a combination of, yes, some foam rolling that's consistently done and some passive stretching, some PNF, some of these eccentrics, all of these done in conjunction. It doesn't need to be an hour's worth of stretching. It can be done in 15 minutes, all done together in some kind of series, but it needs to be done consistently and it needs to be done with a varied approach, essentially.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that sums it up very well. And I think we're doing the best that we can to summarize the literature and use what we think is useful. It may change. Science changes all the time, but those 5 things are kind of what we know have a decent amount of support behind them, and it maybe will change. I've done a little bit less foam rolling, more eccentrics in these days, but eccentrics make sense from a logical point of view because, again, the theory of why muscles are getting longer are that mechanical and neurological, and eccentrics satisfy the criteria for both of those, right? By doing that slow lower, you might be putting a lot of time under tension through the collagenous tissue, through the muscle tissue, and causing some, elongation over time, but also you're neurologically desensitizing maybe that end range of motion, which is something we talk about significantly at times, is that you need to be prepared for the worst case scenario. And if you're doing the proper drills, progressions, and things that you suggest from a technical point of view, you're going to be developing strength through full range of motion, which is something we all preach at Power Monkey Camp versus the classic get your first muscle up and you catch high and then a workout comes along and you're in the bottom of a dip and you start blowing your shoulder up. So we talk about, we've talked about this on the weightlifting side. Like you would do a lot of tempo pause front squats to develop that bottom position really well. Well, tempo pause muscle ups are equally as important to try to prepare the bottom of that dip position again, because you're trying to build robustness and capacity of the tissue to handle it from a muscular point of view and spare some of the passive tissue or the passive stabilizers like the labrum or the capsule or stuff like that.
Love it. Listen to that. Very, very important piece to your well-being in the long run, listeners. Very, very critical. Mobility and strength.
Hashtag save your labrums.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I want to spend just a minute to kind of recap some of this stuff because I think it's important to point out, and hopefully the listeners are taking this in, how much all this stuff that you've covered, Tilley, works together. If you have imbalances in your body, mobility and flexibility wise, if the strength ratios that you talked about are off, what both of those mean, one or the other or both of them together, is that your general movement, any movement that you're doing, say you're doing Grace, 30 clean and jerks for time, repetitive action, maybe you're doing Fran, man, that just made me cringe and sweat there for a second. But 21, 15, 9 thrusters and pull-ups, and those things are out of balance, then your movement is compensated in some way. And now let's think about the volume that you're using in your programming. If it's off, you're doing too much, then that's why so many athletes, it makes it pretty easy for me to understand why so many athletes are having reoccurring injuries, for example, or injuries in general, but especially those reoccurring injuries are 100% signs of one of those 3 things, if not 2, if not 3 of those things being out of whack. So if you are an athlete that has reoccurring injuries, or athletes that do, maybe you're a coach and some of your athletes do, then you need to examine mobility balances. You need to examine strength balances, and you need to examine volume. Now, if someone is out of balance mobility or strength wise, then their volume needs to be less, and their program needs to be more and more specialized towards what they need to be working on. And I think that's kind of hopefully sums up at least a little bit with everything that we've been talking about.
Yeah, super well said. I mean, I'll wrap it up quickly on that point, but every time you're moving suboptimally, you're putting more stress on certain areas. Our goal with the body, and especially in very complex movements, handstand push-ups, muscle-ups, snatches, clean and jerks, running, your goal is to spread the stress out optimally across multiple joints so that nothing is getting overloaded. If you don't have full overhead shoulder elevation, or if you're super strong in your front and you're not as strong in the upper back, well, you're going to put extra stress probably on the shoulder joint, or your lower back for some people, your wrist for some people, right? Everyone has a different kind of way they adapt. So from an injury risk point of view, you're overloading certain areas versus having shared stress across the whole body. But then from the performance point of view, if we talk about grace, right, with clean and jerks, if every single clean and jerk you have to catch 5 degrees forward and catch that weight and move forward, it's extra steam you're blowing out of the tank, and you're putting more effort and you're putting more time into those workouts. So from a performance point of view, you definitely can't lift the heaviest amount of weight you can lift if you're not having good optimal positions. You're probably at more of an injury risk because you're overloading certain areas, and you're definitely going to blow yourself up faster because you're having to constantly, do extra work on every repetition. If you watch some of the greatest, right, the Fronings of the world, the Frasers of the world, the Catrins of the world, some of their movement quality at the end of the workout is so high because they're disciplined about their technique and they put in so many hours and work that they can move well, move heavy, but they can also keep themselves at a lower injury risk.
Yeah, technique equals efficiency. That's for sure.
For sure.
All right, Dave. Well, we're already kind of over an hour here, and I could talk to you about this stuff. I don't know why this just maybe excites me, hopefully the listeners as well, but I just love talking about this stuff. It really is something that I find to be fascinating, and not only, really, really cool, interesting topics, but something that's really important for, the sport that I love, gymnastics, and also really applicable to the world that we're living in now with CrossFit and everything. But we're going to be coming to the end. We just got a couple last little questions for you before we get you out of here. First one's an easy one, I'm hoping. One that we always ask our guests, and with your background, I'm hoping you'll be answering.
You never know
correctly. In your opinion, what sport or discipline is better, gymnastics or weightlifting?
Gymnastics, absolutely.
Thank you. Nice and easy. I think Chad, you just need to start bringing more weightlifters on.
I know. I mean, it's definitely
That
motivating.
was a loaded, that was a biased question.
Yeah, you would never come back on again, Dave, if you didn't answer.
I would lose my job at Power Monkey if I.
Well, I mean, I'm very, very motivated to try to find a gymnast somewhere that I can talk into, that I can change. Maybe I can change their perspective and opinion. Hey, maybe, you never know. Whoever it is, I need to find them and get them on here. And it's motivating for me, Tilley, just to stay on top of you at camp. And
what did Vanessa say? Have you asked Vanessa?
No, not yet.
That's an offense right there.
Well, Serbus, who is a weightlifter, did not give us an answer, so I didn't even get a point on that one.
He's very diplomatic.
Doghouse.
Both are equally important. Yeah.
I mean, I know Vanessa loves weightlifting. She's a weightlifting coach at Power Monkey, but she might very well say gymnastics. She's a gymnastics coach and everything else. I don't know what I'm gonna. Dave, I don't have a chance. I'm way too at this point. I'm way too far behind. So, weightlifting is in trouble for sure. But in the end, weightlifting and gymnastics, they're a big part of CrossFit. And as we've talked about many times and said in many different ways, they work together very, very well. I think weightlifters should be doing some sort of gymnastics on a regular basis, and gymnasts need to be doing some sort of weightlifting on a regular basis. And that's the best that I can do. That's the most credit I can get.
I wonder what Hinshaw would say. He's the deciding
We did. Hinshaw actually picked weightlifting.
Wow.
Yeah, he was maybe one of my two, I think. And I kind of didn't give him a chance. I think he was maybe just
he was definitely a weightlifting, and I was very disappointed, but he was full on weightlifter.
Well, I think he is just being nice to me at that point. He knows how far behind I am. But
I thought he was gonna say like tuna fish eating, like we had.
If that was an option, he probably would say that. Yeah, for sure. That actually probably is my favorite between the three of those choices, I would say.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
As a spectator,
cringeworthy moment at Power Monkey.
As a spectator, anyway. So another little last game we like to play, and what we'll play with you today, Tilley, if you're up for it, is the random question game. So you'll pick a number between 1 and 9, and I'll ask the question that goes along with this. Now, if you don't like the question, you can pass it to the other Dave, and he has to answer, which I love that part of this game. And then I'll give you another one.
That's an interesting caveat there.
Yeah. All right. So, and again, I have to do what I can to get some sort of control and credit here when it's all gymnast on this thing. So
let's go. Let's go with 3.
3. All right. Okay, this is a good one. I like it. What is your favorite curse word?
Oh, my mom. Don't listen to this. Oh, Jesus. That's tough. I'm usually so PR on like my side of the fence with shift, but I'm going to go with the classic shit, man. Just like, it's good. It's right in the middle. It's politically a little bit more acceptable than like the F-bomb or something like that. So you usually get away with those versus like, couple heavy hitters, don't want those, but
Yeah.
a couple low ones don't deliver your point as well. Be like, ah, damn.
Yeah.
Like, is he really upset or not? But like, ah, shit. You're like, ooh, all right, we're starting to get there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I like that. That's good. I like it. You're absolutely right there in the middle. Would you say that that's the most common one that you say as well?
Probably not, because I work with kids, so I have to muffle myself a bit more. I usually say damn more, just like, out of the kindness of Oring who's around me. But there's if I'm with my friends and I'm like really just relaxed, I'm not gonna lie, the F might slide out more than usual, just out of like comedic points. You know what I mean? Like, you can really drive home a good story with one classic F bomb.
Well, it can fit into any sentence so easily too. So it's a magical word.
It is very magical. It's a great stress reliever as well. It's certainly the one that I say most often when I'm by
Especially
myself.
these days, right?
I definitely, in a workout, I definitely say F me a lot. I'm like in the middle of a terrible work. I'm like, God, F me. Or F this. That happens a lot in workouts too.
Absolutely. And I would say that the F word's got to be the favorite of most people, and probably the word that's said most frequently. In fact, for a lot of people, the word in general that's said the most, right?
Yeah. Multifaceted. There's a lot of ways you can deliver that.
Yep. Well, Dave, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. I actually was just taking notes here. I have a lot of stuff written down. I'm actually working on a book. Hopefully I'll get it done one of these days, but I'm currently writing the overhead position portion of that. And so I'm going to be able to relate some of what you said in that book. And I'm not going to give you any credit whatsoever. I'm just going to say that I made it up. So yeah, that's as long as you're okay with it.
That's fine. Yeah.
But listeners out there, hopefully you enjoyed the recording as well. We appreciate you listening in. Be sure to head over to powermonkeyfitness.com for services and upcoming events. Check out our Instagram pages for regular teaching and technical content at Power Monkey Fitness, also at Dave Durante and at Ollie Chad. We'd also love to hear from you guys. You can leave us a rating or review wherever you're getting your podcast, or contact us with any questions or requests you have for the show by sending an email to podcast@powermonkeyfitness.com. And on behalf of Power Monkey Fitness, we're your host. I'm Chad Vaughn with Dave Durante. And until next time, thank you all for listening. Real quick, guys, we can cut that little last part out, but we can also probably splice something in. Dave, I didn't give you a chance to do a farewell or a sign off of some sort if you want to.
Me, Dave, or Dave?
You. Yeah, you, Dave Tilley. Yeah.
Nope. I'll just say mine. I thank you guys so much for having me on and for your friendship and all we've done in Power Monkey. And yeah, man, I learn from you guys every time, and I can do this all day. So the more the merrier.
Where can people find you, Dave? What do you got going on? Websites, handles, that kind of stuff.
The last time we tried this, I had a lot of things scheduled, but not so much anymore. Yeah. So you can everywhere you can find me is just Shift. Shiftmovementscience.com is home base. Shift Movement Science on Instagram and all my social media handles. But I don't have much going on. I think the next big thing I'm doing, hopefully it might fall apart, but I'm teaching large free gymnastics clinics at the University of Utah and the University of Alabama that filled up very fast. And they're going to be live streamed across the world for the first thing.
Nice. When are they happening?
June 13th is the Utah one out in Salt Lake City. That's like the West Coast side. And then July 18th is the one at Alabama. So they are going to host me in July. And so it's a combined free effort to help everybody. They're donating their facility. I'm donating my time. And like I said, if we can live stream, if it still goes on, who knows what's going to happen here with COVID, but the fingers are crossed.
Fantastic, Dave. Thanks, buddy.
See ya.